Yeah, so my name is Cory, and today I want to talk about modern JavaScript. And super quick about me, so I kind of had two stages to my career. The first one for about the first 10 years, I was the CTO of a company called Damagi. We make what I believe is the largest open source Django application in existence. I'd be happy to be proven wrong about that. But our project has over 150,000 commits over the last 12 years or so, including about 11,000 from me. And then in the last 4 years or so, I've been doing kind of like side project entrepreneurship, I would say. So building little web applications, mostly in Django, like doing everything myself, building marketing, and then trying to sell stuff online. And yeah. And so my goals for this talk today are two. The first is I want to convince you that modern JavaScript is just like, it's important, it's useful, and maybe most importantly, that it's not too scary. And then I'm hoping to provide you with a roadmap to start using it in your Django projects if you're not already. And the talk is loosely based on a series of articles that I wrote last year, which is available at that URL. And so if you don't follow something I'm doing, or you want to go deep dive into anything I cover here, you can go to that URL, and there's a much longer write-up with a lot more details. So yeah, so why talk about JavaScript? And this slide is like almost too obvious to even put in here, but when I was making this talk, I was just looking at my browser tabs, and I've got Gmail and Google Docs and WhatsApp and Slack and Trello, and all of these applications are using, I'm sure, tons and tons of JavaScript. And to provide a web-based UI that sort of is in line with what people expect on the web these days, you're always gonna be using at least a splash of JavaScript, and more likely maybe even a lot. It's not going away. these are the results from the Stack Overflow developer survey last year. JavaScript is the most used language among developers. It's been in that position for the last 8 years, and probably not going to be unseated anytime soon. And it's better than many people think. And so these are now the most loved frameworks from that same survey. And if you look at this list, like 4 out of the top 5 frameworks are JavaScript frameworks. And they're all about Django. Django's down here at number 7, which I found kind of surprising. But I think in the Python Django world, that's often I often find myself joking that JavaScript is not great and people don't like working with it, but people do love working with JavaScript, and that's one of the goals I have, is to convince you that you might love it also. And it's hard. And when I first started doing web development way back in 2008, JavaScript was hard because it was just like kind of this like goofy, quirky language, and you had to worry about browser compatibility for everything you did. And if you use 2 equals instead of 3 equals, you might introduce bugs in your code. And it was just kind of like this. It was a quirky language. And these days, it still has its quirks, but the reason JavaScript is hard today, I think, is because it's so complicated. And there's so many different pieces of the ecosystem. There's frameworks, there's tools, there's like syntaxes. And if you're a Django developer, if you're trying to get started, and then you're like, okay, I want to use some JavaScript, and then you're faced with this incredible complexity of choices of what to do, then you can kind of just get overwhelmed, and you say, well, I don't want to like worry about any of that stuff. That seems really complicated. I'll just do something much simpler. And so yeah, again, I think one of my goals is to convince you that it's not as bad, or maybe to pick out some of the bits of this that are useful. And the last thing I'll say about motivation is just JavaScript isn't that standardized in the Django ecosystem. And so if you Google Django JavaScript, at least when I do it, the very first result is this is the Django contributor guide to, like, if you want to add JavaScript code to the Django admin site, this is the style guide for how to do that. And I was really surprised by that, because I have to imagine that the number of people who have contributed JavaScript to the Django core is not that many, but Google still thinks it's the most relevant page to return about Django and JavaScript. You can also see these questions like, can I use JavaScript in Django, which I found funny, or how do I connect JavaScript to Django? And yesterday I was looking at the conference schedule, and like I think I counted at least 6 talks, not including this one, just with people with different ways of using Django with JavaScript. There's also at least 2 talks that are kind of like, here's how to use Django without JavaScript entirely. And so yeah, so there's not standards to this. I'm going to propose another way, yet another way. But hopefully what I'm talking about will be more of like a fundamentals and less of a specifics. And so yeah, so this talk is kind of broken up into 3 parts. The first is about front-end organization. So just kind of like how your front-end code interacts with your Django projects. The second will be on integrating a React application into a Django project. And that's not because I think React is the best framework or anything else, but I think a lot of the things that come up will come up with any modern JavaScript framework, and it's a good way to explain a lot of these concepts. And then in the last bit, I'll just touch on some of the benefits and features of this modern complex JavaScript ecosystem. So let's talk about organizing front-end code. And I'll start with what I consider to be the default architecture for a Django project, which is like you build out your site using your your views and your templates and your forms. You realize at some point that you need something dynamic to happen on a page. So you throw in some inline JavaScript to your template, maybe a library or 2, and then repeat. Right. And so these projects are often using jQuery, at least 5 or 10 years ago. These days, they might be using something different like Alpine. But basically, yeah, like this approach, it's actually kind of great, right? And I do love it, especially for small projects. It's super simple. Like we all recognize it. We all know how to work in this environment. One nice side effect is your pages are usually self-contained. You've got your template stuff here, and then you've got your JavaScript stuff down here. So you can really easily see how everything interacts. You don't have to go chasing files around and stuff. But there are some problems with this, and most of the problems arise over time as your front-end code base grows, as your project grows. And so things like code sharing across templates, sort of figuring out where in your template inheritance you want to include your JavaScript libraries, how you're going to manage that, mixing Django and JavaScript together. And what I found is these can often lead to these kind of homegrown front-end organizational systems. And this example is from that big open source Django project I mentioned. And the way that we were managing dependencies, even to this date, although we're migrating away from it, is in our views, we annotate like the request with which JavaScript libraries we're going to need for that page. And so in this particular example, you could see like this, if this request needs NVD3, the graphing library, then include these 4 files that NVD3 depends on in the base template. And this is kind of problematic for a lot of reasons. Like your logic is spread out in a bunch of places. This annotation happens in the view. This library import is happening in a base template somewhere. The actual code that calls the JavaScript is probably living somewhere else in another template or in a different JavaScript file somewhere. And so like this often leads to front-end code that feels a little bit spaghetti-like. And another side effect, which I'll touch on later, is that you're also not leveraging a lot of what modern JavaScript can do and can do to mitigate this problem. So is there a better way to do this? And a few other talks have mentioned this already, but this is kind of, if you Google how to use React and Django together, you'll end up with an architecture that looks something like this, where you have a standalone front end on one side and then a completely standalone backend on the other side. These 2 projects are usually completely separate in terms of code. They might even be in different repositories, and they only will typically talk to each other through APIs. And this can be great too. It will let you go all in with a JavaScript framework. And so if you love React and you just like want to do everything in React, then you can do that. And you can have a server, a Django on the back end to do all the good stuff that Django can do. You also get this nice separation of your backend and your front end, which arguably could lead to sort of better modular API design. It also helps your team. Like if you have people who exclusively work on the front end, they can do that. They can point at a staging site, and they don't have to worry about databases and Python and any of these things. So this can also be a really nice way to structure a project. But there are problems, and I don't like it for my own projects, primarily because I feel like every time I try to get anything done in this architecture, it takes like 4 times as long as I think it should. And so instead of being able to just quickly drop in a Django form on something, you have to create an API. You have to like do a UI library front end thingy. You have to potentially do routing on the front end, and it's just, I find it really slows down velocity of development, and it also makes deployment harder. You might have to run like a Node process on one side and a Python process on the other. You might start dealing with cross-origin stuff if these two front end and back end are running on different subdomains, and you're losing a ton. And so looking at the sort of lists that gets included into the intro to Django on the Django talks, like you're throwing away Django's URLs and view systems, you're throwing away templates, you're throwing away forms, and then like you are using obviously the ORM and you're using the auth system, you're getting a lot of Django security, but you're in a world where you're wrapping those things with libraries. And so you're not in sort of core Django land anymore, you're in like Django Plus, and a lot of the stuff has to get re-implemented in your front end code base. And so Django has this philosophy, batteries included, which is one of the reasons I love it, one of the reasons why I expect a lot of us love it. And in this world, it's kind of like, nah, like bring your own batteries. Like, and so I call this like the Energizer Bunny. I wanted to give it a picture. So he's carrying his own batteries along instead of using ones that maybe are already living inside Django. And so these are options. Like, do we need to choose between this nice, simple, familiar thing that doesn't necessarily scale all that well, that gets kind of unwieldy, or this beautiful decoupled modern thing that slows us down and makes us throw away a lot of what's in Django? And thankfully, like the answer is no. And what I wanted to do, and what I think is a good way to structure a lot of projects is getting the best of both worlds, where you can have you can default to Django URLs, views, templates, everything we know and love. And then when you need to like drop in a splash of modern JavaScript when it makes sense, and combine those two things. And so I'm the rest of the talk I'm gonna deep dive into one way that you can set this up. But just to like quickly summarize how I think about these 3 choices. The first one is kind of like, it can work really well for super small projects, but kind of never. Like if you're going to do anything on the front end, you might as well go through the effort of getting into sort of like a hybrid world. The client server one I think is great if you love JavaScript frameworks, or if you have this team structure where your front end back end developers are separated. And the third one I find is really nice for people like me who love Django, want to use Django, but then also want to do like complex stuff on the front end sometimes. And I think it works really well for solo developers as well, where you move from the front end to the back end and you're kind of owning the whole stack. So yeah, let's dive into that. And I'm going to do it again in the context of integrating a React application into a Django project. And so what we want to do is basically this. So we want to have our normal Django thing with our views and our templates and our static files. And then like somewhere in that static world, we want this magical React thing. And so how do we get this blue box? And if you go to the React tutorial, you'll see like a whole world that looks like this. It's like, oh, okay, you just import React and then you call this. And when I was looking at this, and if you haven't sort of spent a lot of time in modern JavaScript world, like you might be thinking like import React, like what does that mean? Like don't I have to like add a script tag and point it at a CDN or something like that? And then you might see this H1 thing and you're like, well, that doesn't look like valid JavaScript syntax. Like that's not a string. What is that? And because it's not. And if you drop this into a Django template, or if you drop this into a web page, like your browser will just say, I don't know what to do with this thing. I don't know how to import this. I don't know how to read this H1 thing. And And that's because you need a tool chain in order to do development like this. I put a little asterisk there because you don't technically need a tool chain to use React, but you do need it to sort of use React in a way that I recommend using it. And so why do we have tool chains? And basically it's so that we can do modern stuff on legacy browsers. And so JavaScript, unlike Python, when you're building a web application, you can't really control the JavaScript environment that is being used. So your users might be on the latest version of Chrome, and then you can support that. But if you're not, if they're using some ancient version of IE or something like that, then the browser still needs to ideally work on that. The JavaScript should work on that browser. And so what toolchains do is they have let the JavaScript world continue to advance, to continue to add good stuff. They added modules, so you can do imports just like you can do Python stuff. They added new syntaxes that make building UIs easier. And a toolchain will let you write your code this way and then turn it into something that actually still works on any browser. And so once you learn that, it's like, okay, what toolchain should I use? And the React docs for integrating with an existing code base send you over to this more flexible toolchain section. And then you're like, oh, okay. And like looking at this, it's like the fact that there's 4 options, the fact that like combining the power of Webpack with the simplicity of presets, like if you're not in the JavaScript world, if you don't like know what a lot of these words mean, this is just, again, you just sort of reach this point where you're like, what am I reading? Like, why is this so complicated? And then again, it's like, it's easy to just give up and just, stupid JavaScript and move on. But it's really not that complicated. And so I want to try to explain to you what a toolchain is from its primitives. And a toolchain basically just has 3 things. There's a package manager, a compiler, and a bundler. And so the package manager's job is, the easiest way to think about it is it's pip. So you're going to use it to install your libraries. It'll pin the versions for you. And yeah, it'll do everything that pip does. And NPM and Yarn are the most popular package managers. You can just use NPM. You can also use Yarn, but these recommendations I'll give, they're just, it's not because I have strong opinions and I've deeply researched all this stuff. It's just like, I want to use JavaScript. Like, I just want to use the boring stuff. And so all the recommendations I give here are just the most popular thing that will be the most supported, will have like the best documentation, etc. So that's the package manager. The next thing is the compiler. And the compiler is the thing that's going to take that modern syntax stuff and then turn it into stuff that your browser understands. And so you can see here that example with these H1s, which this is called JSX, which I'll touch on later. It'll take this and turn it into just a normal JavaScript function call, which can then be dropped into a browser and used. And so Babel is the most popular compiler. It's what I use. It's what I recommend. And then the last thing is the bundler. And the bundler, it does a lot, but its main job is to take JavaScript code that spans files and libraries and whatever else and smash it together into a single file, which is called a bundle. And so you can write your code, you can have your code spread around wherever you want. You can import libraries and call library functions, and your bundler will take all that, it'll figure out your dependencies, it'll take everything you need for that project and then bundle it together so that you can then just drop that bundle file onto your web page. And so you don't have to do any of this crazy stuff with dependency management across multiple places. That all just lives natively in your JavaScript code. Your JavaScript code declares its own dependencies. Your bundler takes care of making sure they're available for you in that page. So putting it together, we have NPM, which we'll use to like install stuff, manage our libraries, our imports. Babel, we'll take our source code and compile it down into browser-friendly stuff. Webpack, the bundler, will take all that together, create the files that we need, and then we can just drop those files directly into our browser. And finally, we have something that works. And so going way back to this picture, we can just shove that whole thing in front of Django. So you can have all of this on the left side, and it just spits out a bundle file that you can then drop into your Django static files, use just like any other Django static file that you would. And then you're using React or whatever modern JavaScript directly inside your Django views and your Django templates. So what does that look like just in terms of file system? So this is how I structure my projects. So you have your normal Django manage.py, your site, your app, and then you can basically just like add a folder anywhere. I call it assets, where you have essentially your front end code base. And then that will go through this pipeline and then again just gets dropped into your normal static folder. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. And then just to close the loop on this example, so this is back to our hello world React application. And you can see, like, we write this on the left, it goes through the pipeline, and then we just include it as a normal static file as we would include any other static file in a Django template. And then the only other bit of communication happening here is in the Django template, we've defined this div with an ID root, and React will grab that ID and use it to render itself. And so this example is obviously very simple. It'll just do a hello world, but the React application in here could be arbitrarily complex. So this could be a single page app with a bunch of different routes and whatever else, and you can serve it at any Django endpoint that you want. And if you do that with Django, then you're also, you can continue to use Django for session management. You can use the auth system. If you want, you can drop in normal Django template variables and convert them to JSON, have that work with your React app. So I find this is a really nice way to sort of get the best of both worlds with using React and sort of keeping most of what's in Django. And yeah, there's a much more comprehensive example where I walk through all of this, including how to work with the database, work with APIs, do create, update, delete cycles, URL routing, and all that. If you go to that link, yeah, so I didn't have time to go through all of that in the talk, but it's all there on the site. Cool. And so, yeah, so what's the payoff? Like, in some ways, all I've done so far is just add like 100 new tools and a lot more complexity to your already probably complicated Django project. And so why would you do this? And there's a lot of things that you get. You get to use the latest JavaScript frameworks, which will mostly assume that you have some version of a pipeline or a toolchain in place. And I'll say from experience that despite being skeptical for a long time, building complicated UIs in these frameworks is just like a really nice experience and really increases your velocity once you get over the hump of wrapping your heads around them and setting up the toolchain and everything else. You get dependency management, you get new features and syntaxes, language extensions, and I didn't even have time to touch on this, but you also get other front end good stuff like Sass, which is kind of a nicer way to use CSS, and other things like that. But if I could summarize the payoff in one sentence, it's just like you get to treat your front end code base like a real code base. And so it's not this spaghetti thing that's scattered across your templates, and your libraries are being imported ad hoc in various places, and like who knows where you find the right JavaScript function. Like, your front end code base is organized into modules. It has like it manages its own libraries, the versions, and all of this. You have nice IDE support with being able to do development how you would expect to do development, and how you're already doing development in Python and in Django. A few specific stuff that has happened in the JavaScript world. So this is kind of old news at this point. ES6 was the last really big update to JavaScript, which I think came out in 2015. But a lot of people are still not using it or don't know all about it. One of the big things it added was modules. So we've seen that already, but you can define functions wherever you want and then import them from other places. So this allows you to organize your code in a structured and sane way instead of just ad hoc. It added classes as first-class citizens to JavaScript. So those of us who were doing web development maybe 10 or 15 years ago remember that there were just all these different patterns around doing classes in JavaScript, but now there's sort of a defined way to do it. It added arrow functions, which are basically lambdas, and these get really useful when you're building UIs in frameworks, and you want to do sort of a lot of inline functions that update a variable or change a UI element, that type of stuff. It has template strings, which are just like f strings and are nice to work with. Default argument values, and there's a ton more stuff in here. This was just like the 5 or 6 that I picked, and yeah, other stuff. So JSX, this is how React recommends that you build your user interfaces. It's kind of like if JavaScript and HTML had a baby. It's also kind of like the Django template system, and basically it allows you to write what looks almost like HTML. It's not quite HTML. It's actually more XML-y. But in it, you can inject these brackets and then write arbitrary JavaScript code. But this allows you to build your UIs in JavaScript in sort of just as nice a way as you would in a Django template system. And I'll say, like, React also has nice state management capabilities that make doing this type of stuff also a lot more pleasant. So you define this UI element once, and then it will sort of read the state of your latest object and update your UI accordingly. So you don't have to worry as much about sort of like trigger-based event systems updating your UIs. Vue has a different take, which is to create standalone components that are sort of modular, like a single file. And so a Vue file is broken into 3 sections with the template at the top, which is similar to a Django template again. A script section in the middle where you define your business logic and where you can map the data in your template to JavaScript logic, and then kind of built-in styles as well. These styles can be scoped, which is nice. So you can have a Vue component define its own styles, and then you don't have to worry that those styles would bleed out into the rest of your page. And then TypeScript is another nice thing that's been added. It's very, very similar to Python 3's type hints, but this will allow you to define types for class properties or for function arguments or pretty much everything. And then you'll get nice compile time errors and IDE support and other things when any data is not the type that you expect. And like the Python type hints, these can be incrementally added to your code base. So any valid JavaScript is already valid TypeScript, and then you can just drop in the type hints sort of as you go. And a lot more. And I'll say, like, I don't consider myself to be any sort of JavaScript expert or guru or anything like that. I still consider myself a Python developer, a Django developer. And so I really only myself have touched the tip of the iceberg, and in this talk touched the tip of the iceberg. But yeah, like the JavaScript world, the JavaScript ecosystem these days, it's a lot better than I think I thought it was, a few years ago before I started really getting into it. And I find these days that I enjoy, building applications in JavaScript, writing JavaScript code, almost as much as I enjoy it in Python. Not quite as much, but maybe 80% as much. And because it's the language of the browser, investing in that really increases what you can do as a full stack developer. And so I encourage you, if you're not already, to try and do some modern JavaScript stuff. Get over the hump of the fear of this ecosystem, because on the other side, it's a nice place to be. Yeah, so thanks. And for the comprehensive examples of all of this, you can go to sasspegasus.com and click guides. Sass Pegasus is one of my internet side hustles that I mentioned. And I am Sizu on Twitter, and CoryZoo.com is my website. I talk about development and about sort of trying to make a living online. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Cory. Please if anybody has any questions to Cory, please follow the face-to-face link below. Nice talk.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll jump in there.
You can go ahead, John. Eu sei, vocês sabem coisas.
Hello. Sorry, that took me a little while to find the right links. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Cory. That was good. You mentioned still using Django templates, and I didn't see an example of that. I more saw that you've got an example of where you put your code, but you were talking more about using templating on the front end. So, how would you combine that?
Yeah, maybe I didn't articulate that clearly. So the example I kind of powered through was how you would mostly ditch Django templates for React, but that would just be one page. And so any other page you want, you could not use React at all, and you can just use Django itself. Like because you're doing all of that in the normal Django in the normal Django way, serving your React app inside a Django view. Like any other view can just directly use a Django template. It's mixing and matching Django templates and React apps. Like what I typically do is I'll have a base template with just my UI scaffolding, like navigation and sidebar and stuff, and then let React take over in sort of the main content pane. And I find that usually works pretty well. And when I'm building an app, like probably 90% of my pages will be normal Django templates, and then like there'll be one or two pages that are really complicated React apps because they have a lot of interactivity.
Okay. Do you struggle to keep the theme consistent?
A bit. It's easier if you're using frameworks like CSS frameworks, because then you can just add the same classes on the React side to the Django side. I haven't actually had a ton of issues with that, but I could, like, it is true that the styling doesn't quite perfectly translate from the Django world into the React world. That you can use if you use exclusively CSS classes. It mostly does. A lot of people, when they're in a modern like JavaScript world, they like doing more explicit style imports and other things like that. And I haven't found a good way to make all that work together.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the question.
Hi, I have also a question. When you use a React page, how do you communicate then? Do you use classical REST API like the single page application approach, or do you try to inject like to a template some data for the React app?
Yeah, it kind of depends for me. But I'll usually do one of those two things. If it's kind of like if you know the size of what's going to be needed. One of the nice things about doing the hybrid thing is, like, for example, if you just have some config, like a single object that you want to be available to React, then you can just serialize that object directly to the Django template, and then you don't have to worry about APIs calls or whatever. You just assign it to a variable, and your React code has access to that variable. If you're doing like a list view and there might be 5 things, or there might be 500 things, and you want to have pagination and all that, then you get more into API territory. And you can mix and match those 2 things. So I have, like in the example I mentioned, there's a list of employees, which is handled by an API, and then there's some static data like choice lists, which can just get passed directly to the template as JSON.
Thank you.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was wondering, maybe I missed it in your talk, but I was wondering if you have any experience with combining this using CDNs like S3 or something like that, where the statics are, let's say, uploaded somewhere else.
Yeah, that works fine. So as long as you're using, like, once you build the bundle file, which I usually do as part of my CI/CD pipeline, then that bundle file is available just like any other static file. So it can be, you can deploy it to a CDN, or you can drop it to S3 or whatever else. It's at that point, it's just the same as a regular image or anything else that you have.
And maybe I missed that as well, but because normally in compiling, let's say, the bundle files, you have like a dev mode and a production mode. At least in React it works like that, and they can be quite different in that sense. How do you deal that using, let's say, development, because you want to have that live reloading this,
So in dev, I build the bundles directly into my static folder, and so Django just serves them just like it would everything else from the dev server, and then those are get ignored, and then in prod I run the same thing to build them first before I run collect static, and then collect static will handle everything else once they're there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
I have another question, which is, you just mentioned that you usually have a bunch of just regular Django endpoints, and then a few bits of your websites are React or whatever it is. Do you run into a problem with basically resource duplication, where you are loading the same stuff in different parts of the application? And how do you go around that?
Yeah,
I think is a common pitfall.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of, I use 2 options for that, and there might be smarter ways to do this, but like, if you have a small number of pretty different like single page apps, then you can just have a single bundle for each of those, and in that bundle will include like all its dependencies also, and so like the upside of that is that each page is is only loading one JavaScript file essentially. The downside of that is that when you click from one page to the other, it has to like download all of the dependencies and everything else on that second page. And so the other way you can set it up is to kind of declare the dependencies a little more explicitly and have like a dependencies file, and then have the sort of just the stuff that's unique to that page sitting on top of that. And yeah, like if I had a bunch of different pages, I would probably do it that way. But I've never actually had enough where it was a big problem. And once you load the page once, like the browser will cache it until the next time. So I never had
to deal with that. Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, can I ask you?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay. We did see the inclusion of the JavaScript framework into the Django project. I myself have a feeling that when you really dive into the JavaScript framework, it does pose a very big challenge for sharing that with Django developers amongst each other. Yeah, the problem of sharing model information, which is sort of like one of the instigators of trying to get it inside the project anyway, I also felt that pain. I solved that by by actually using the options call that is usually exposed by the REST framework. Are you aware with what the options call is exposing about the REST framework? And if so, did you ever try that route?
I'm aware that it exists, but no, I don't know. I don't know a lot about that or how that would
The
work.
good thing is that the options call on the REST framework sort of does an introspection of the model that it is serving, along with all choice fields and possible values that you can have for choice fields. And so you can actually make a dynamic form on your JavaScript library that interprets what the option call is offering, and on the fly generate a form for using on your models on the backend. And for me, that paid off more than trying to include the dynamic generation of JavaScript inside the Django project, because yeah, you can have a cleaner separation there. I was very much fighting the code on the one end and including something here, okay, but yeah, then look into it, because you'll be surprised what you can achieve with it. It's really awesome.
Yeah, that's cool. I think there's kind of three options for keeping those objects in sync. One is like ad hoc manual. One is this like introspecting the API metadata, as you're saying, and the third, like I think I haven't actually done this myself, but I have some friends who I respect a lot who say that GraphQL plus tooling just like solves this for you. And then you can you define. I don't exactly know where the model lives, but it lives in one place and it generates your JavaScript models and your Django models. So that's another route that I've been interested in exploring.
Okay, thanks.
I'll try and go next, if that's okay. Thank you, Cory. I'm very much a JS developer myself, so it's always good to see some JavaScript love around there. I wanted to ask about your point about Django being batteries included and there not being much batteries for JavaScript. Do you see that as a good thing that Django doesn't have much opinions, or would you think that, on the contrary, Django should try and have more built-in support for more modern approaches?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think Django should do what it's good at. I think there's there's danger in trying to do too much, and also with the front end ecosystem being what it is and moving as quickly as it is, there's also sort of like, you could imagine a substantial either maintenance burden or getting stuck on some tool or library or something that ends up sort of losing favor. So I guess it's good. I think it'd be nice if Django said like, here's like 3 or 4 ways of doing this that we recommend, and maybe that was like a documentation thing. But I don't think Django should like ship with React or anything like that. There's plenty of open source projects that will give you architectures like that.
Thanks.
I've got another question, which is, I mean, this was really these kind of questions are really the reason I came to the conference, and also to hear about Hotwire and HTMX. And this sort of thing.
I'm excited for those also.
I've been thinking those sort of things for a few months myself, and excited to see that other people have those things, because I've been working with Vue and Django for the last 6 to 8 months, previously being Django and a plane developer, and I find that Vue's well architected and it's got everything there, but it's shifting all your tech onto the front end, and all your tooling and all your knowledge onto front end stuff, and Django becomes a headless API server, as you mentioned. But then what you then find is that there's a few complaints that maybe Vue isn't fast enough, and you need to do server-side rendering, and you end up with a node running on the server. And yeah, I don't know, you didn't mention server-side rendering and all of that. And yeah, I think that's why there's a bit of distaste. One of the reasons is a bit of distaste in frameworks, communities like Django.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry, it wasn't really a question, but yeah, no. Did server-side rendering come up?
Yeah, it never has for me, and I think I guess because, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but my sense of server-side rendering is really good and important for pages that like you want Google to index well, and a lot of people are going to hit, and I find that those pages are usually relatively static, and so for those I just I make them Django pages, and then Django's handling the server-side rendering for you. But yeah, no, if I had a really complex UI that I wanted to be server-side rendered, I don't know what I would do. I would be sad. I would be sad.
Okay. That's fair. Okay, but you haven't hit performance issues with that?
I haven't personally. I mean, most of the applications I've built, the complex UIs are happening sort of post login, and so at that point, I feel like the penalty for the first time you log in, it's a little slow, but like Google's not indexing that page anyway. Like there's the upside is maybe like less important.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
I wouldn't build my landing page in like client-side rendered React necessarily.
Yeah, cool. Oh, thank you. I think it really helped clarify
cool.
quite a few things. I'm grateful.
Glad to hear.
Sure. But yeah, I look forward to hearing your questions on the Hotwire and HTMX.
I know. Well, yeah, I don't know much about them, so I'm looking forward to learning about it as well.
Cool.
Anybody else? All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
I think we're done.
See you. Cheers.